Hi, and welcome back to the second edition of Brokenomics. And today we're going to be talking about inflation. Now, inflation is a huge topic. There's a huge amount of disagreement about everything to do with this, from establishment economists, everything from the definition to how it's measured. Literally, establishment economists like to pretend that inflation is just this weird, unknowable force of nature. The only thing that they really concern themselves with is wage inflation. Because, of course, that drives up the costs for businesses, the sort of people that fund their campaigns, and it's for the owners of capital. And I kid you not, you will literally see interviews, and perhaps we can add one here, where economists and central bankers will try and convince you that inflation is this complex, mystifying phenomenon that sort of just comes out of the ether.
One way to say it would be, I think we now understand better how little we understand about inflation.
That's not very reassuring.
No, honestly, this was unpredicted. I was looking at our at the time of our June meeting 1 year ago, of the 35 people who file with a survey of professional forecasters, 34 of them had inflation below 4% for last year. And of course, it was way above 4%.
What I'm going to talk about in this video is it's actually just theft. It's a way for government to get bigger. And I truly believe that if everybody understood inflation the way that you will at the end of this video, people would be angry. You would have mobs outside Parliament, and perhaps by the end of this, you'll be coming around to my view on it. But it's essentially the only thing that is holding together the financial system at this point. And once we get into this and a couple of other topics, you'll understand how it all ties in. Okay, so before we actually come to inflation, I just wanted to talk about what the natural order of things should be, absent the effect that money has on our system. So the natural order of things is actually that prices should fall over time without government. And that's simply because technology helps us get more for less over time. Now, you're seeing this in your own lifetime with something like computers. They got considerably better and considerably cheaper at the same time. Now, I use computers as an example because the rate of change in those things was so obvious that you could see it on a year-to-year basis. But actually, the technological effect works on basically everything. I watched a clip come up on Twitter the other day about a company that produces firewood en masse. And they've got it down to a fine art. The firewood just comes absolutely flying out at the end of the process. It's because they have over the years invested in capital and ways of working that just gets those incremental improvements, and it adds up to a huge amount over time. Now, you think back to people living in, say, 1922, 100 years ago. Just things as simple as maintaining a home. They didn't have bin bags. So the housewives would have to literally line the bin with newspaper each day. There was no vacuums. You had to pick up the rugs and beat them outside. There was no washing machine. You had to do that by hand. There was no dishwasher. So the time and effort that it took to do all of the jobs around the home are things that you can do these days on a Saturday morning while listening to a podcast. So all technology is deflationary and it gives us more for less. So if you had a stable money system, then of course your money would be buying you more each year. And I do want to make the point, it's not just advanced technology. It is literally any technology that lowers your costs. So clay pots. Take, for example, that film with Tom Hanks, where he's stranded on the island. Can't remember the name of it now, but he's stranded on the island. And when he first gets there, he takes up literally all of his time just meeting the basic needs. He's catching fish with his hands. He's walking to the fresh water supply. He's laboriously building a fire. And by the time he's been there a few years, he's invented the spear. It saves him a huge amount of time. He's built water vessels. So all of this gives him time back so that he can enjoy leisure activities at the end of it. Now, that is the natural order of things, is that we get better at what we do, we invent technology, and so prices should fall. Now, I know that, us on the right are going to be no fans of an economist like John Maynard Keynes. But he didn't get everything wrong. And he predicted back when he was writing that by now, by the turn of the century, people would only be working 15 hours a week because he could see these incremental improvements coming by. Now, obviously that has not happened. You're not working 15 hours a week. So how do we explain this? How do we explain that there's been all of this progress, all of these improvements to the way we work, and yet we're working longer and we are poorer? Well, it's because of this inflation effect. Now, before I get on to how that's caused today, let's just remind ourselves that actually inflation is not the norm over long periods. So for many centuries, actually, prices were fairly stable. That was caused by an interesting phenomenon where the rate of progress, working practices and technology over the very long term tended to be somewhere in the sort of 1% to 2% a year range. So slight improvements in the plough, in farming methods, or in weaving or whatever it was, about 1 or 2% a year. And it also turned out that the rate of what we were using as money, so the rate of extraction of things like gold and silver, was also around about 1 or 2% a year. And these two effects, they basically cancelled each other out over the long term. And so you look back in history and you see long periods, centuries of price stability. Now, that's not to say that there was always price stability, because there were times when government got involved and they debased that currency. And these periods are very notable in history. They really do stand out. So a couple of examples. The Roman soldiers towards, I think it was about the 3rd century, refused to fight. And the reason is because the Roman currency, the silver denarii, had been basically so debased. They'd added in so many other metals, presumably tin and other stuff like that, that the soldiers said, look, we're happy to fight, but we want gold. We're not going to do it for the denarii anymore. And, this is a thing that crops up periodically, and it's always very noticeable. I was just thinking this morning when I was coming in, I was reminded, because I knew I was going to do this video, and I was thinking of a book that I read many years ago, and it was on King Henry VIII. And in that book, the author was talking about King Henry had a period of very high inflation, and it was very debilitating. Now, the author was obviously didn't know anything about economics, and he was trying to claim that it was a failure of Henry not to institute price controls. Now, I know without looking it up, and I've deliberately not looked it up, I'm going to go and have a word with our resident history buff, Bew, after I've made this video. But I know without looking it up that what was happening at that time was that they were debasing the currency. He would have been clipping coins, he would have been adding tin to the silver, he would have been adding copper to the gold and everything else. He would have been finding ways, because basically he would have run out of money. So without knowing anything about the detail, whenever this has cropped up in history, it's because of the same mechanisms. Those mechanisms are exactly the same today. They were the same in the 70s. They were the same in the Roman times. They were the same in King Henry's time. So once you understand the mechanism that goes behind this, these are immutable laws. So really, the establishment economists should not be playing so dumb on this, because actually it's a fairly obvious mechanism. So another example of this would be the 70s in the UK. So I talked about how that historian incorrectly assumed that the way that you deal with inflation is you put price controls in place. And indeed, that's what happened in the 1970s in Britain. So in my last video, when I gave a sort of grand overview of the sort of things that I'll be talking about in this video series, one of the things that I mentioned was that in 1971, the dollar broke from gold, and the dollar became a purely paper-based system. Of course, there's no limit to the amount of money that you can produce if it's paper-based. The UK then did the same thing just a couple of years later, although it was the world was even back then a global dollar-based system, so that would have had effect anyway. So what we saw was a period of high inflation during the 70s, high debt running up with individual corporations. And this thinking that you could use price controls was what they used at the time to try and dampen it down. And back then we had this idea of a social contract. And that was that the unions would limit their wage demands, and in return, businesses would limit the price rises they put forward. And to the mainstream economist, to the average man on the street, to the politician, to the journalist, why wouldn't that work? That would be constrained. Of course, it doesn't work, because the amount of money circulating the system increased. So what you would have found during that period is the workers weren't getting the pay increases, and so they were generally getting squeezed on everything, and the businesses were unable to pass on the increased costs that they were getting from the bottom side, because it wasn't just wages, it would have been other price increases that they'd be getting on raw materials and energy, and all of that would have basically eroded this system to the point that it broke down spectacularly in 1978, and then we had that long winter of discontent where you had rubbish piled up, you had bodies left in the street because everybody, including the undertakers, were on strike, and you had energy rationing, and you'd have the lights going out on a regular basis. So let's try and now get into the defining it side. This is the bit that is so difficult for so many establishment economists. They will tell you that inflation is nothing more than prices rising, whereas the Austrian economists and the more classical economists, and this is the view that I'd always held for a long time, and I think I still do, is that actually the word itself has become corrupted. Because you see, 100 years ago, we didn't have a word for inflation meaning prices going up. We just called it prices going up. The word inflation back then meant that the amount of money in circulation was increasing. And it's actually flipped the other way around now. Now we don't really have a word for the money supply going up. We just say that the money supply is going up, and the word inflation has now been flipped to mean that prices are going up. Now, all of this is very deliberate, because what it helps do is it helps conceal what is happening in the background. Now, what's actually going on, think of it like this. An economy is made up of many goods and services, and we use very little barter in our economy. So all of those, the total sum of those goods and services, is divided by the total amount of money in the system. So as I talked earlier, in the natural order of things, the total amount of goods and services should be increasing because output is increasing, and therefore if you divide one by the other, you're getting more for your money. But actually, what has happened, and very strongly what has happened since the 1970s, is that second half of the equation, the total amount of money, that's been expanding much faster than the growth in goods and services and efficiency. So then what you do is you take the total sum of everything that the economy puts out, be that beer, chairs, haircuts, flights to Argentina, whatever it is, and all of those things, their relative value against each other, divided against a much larger sum, and the price of those things ends up going up. So I simplify it when I talk about it now, and I define it as easy as this. And I say inflation is when your money is worth less over time, and deflation is when your money is worth more over time. If you're living, well, not just in the West, if you're living anywhere today with the size of governments we have, it is very unlikely that you have ever experienced deflation, except in those things where the rate of innovation has been so rapid that even the sort of money printing that we have today wasn't able to cover it up. So that would have been things like computers. Now, in the West, inflation is almost universally caused by that money printing. It's actually also possible to get it through reduction in supply. So if the first half of that equation that we talked about, the total amount of goods and services, if that declines, then of course there's less to be divided by the sum of money. It was almost unheard of to have that in the West over the last 30 years, but we are managing to see it now as a result of turning off the economy for 2 years. So a lot of economic output was basically destroyed. Supply chains got furled up. So for the first time, an element of the inflation we see is caused by the basically destruction of economic output, which is never really something that we had to worry about before, but that's being thrown into the mix as well. Now, another factor on that, of course, is, and I'm going to come back to geopolitics later, is the effect of sanctioning somebody like Russia. So Russia is the world's largest energy exporter. I think Russia and Ukraine are something like the fourth and the fifth biggest, or might even be more than that, fourth or fifth biggest exporter of wheat. Collectively, they are the biggest exporter of fertilizer. Now, all of that is going to be something that's going to be hitting us particularly hard next year. And it's worth touching upon, and I'm going to do that later in the video, the effect that that's going to have on the world and the unstable political regimes and the blowback that might have on us. Okay, so we know the natural order of things relies on hard money because you've got to have that fixed standard. And with paper money, there's no limit to the amount that money can expand. So I can prove to you in a very simple way, in a completely intuitive way, that that's the case, and that the establishment economists are talking nonsense about this subject with something as simple as monopoly. So think of it like this. When you first start playing a game Monopoly with your friends and family, first few times you go around the board, the face value of squares you land on, that's what you pay, because there is relatively little money in the system. But what happens once the game starts to get going? The game comes to its midpoint. More and more money has been injected into it because, of course, you've got whatever it is, 3, 4, 5 players going round Go, collecting an extra 200. So you're injecting like an extra £1,000 into this economy every sort of 4 or 5 turns. And then what happens is people start bidding against each other much larger sums for the same properties. So the face value of Mayfair is still £400, but you're trying to do a deal with the person next to you to buy it off them, and you're saying, "Oh, I'll pay you 600, I'll pay you 800." So it's a fairly straightforward effect of how injecting money into the system causes a limited supply of, in this case, streets to go up. I'll tell you what inflation is not. And this is the thing that everybody defaults to today. Inflation is not CPI, although effectively in our current debate, those two terms become completely interchangeable. You'll hear an economist say, oh, inflation is up, or inflation down, or inflation has reported this. And what they really mean by that is that CPI. So what is CPI? CPI, the definition is it's consumer price index, and it's a weighted average basket of consumer goods and services purchased by households, and then they track the changes in the price of these things, and that is then computed to give you your official CPI rate. So it's a basket of stuff that you might buy. So it could be in the early days, it would have been how much you're paying on your mortgage. It would have been steak. It would have been, I don't know, a TV, a car, something like that. It is a deeply flawed system, deeply, deeply flawed. For a start, what's in the basket changes over time, and they use this substitution idea so they can take stuff out. So literally, if something becomes too expensive in the inflation basket, then the economists behind it will say, okay, well, steak was in there, but now steak is expensive, so people will buy tofu or chicken or something else instead. So they take something out and they put something else in. Naturally, of course, this has the effect of lowering the official rate. Just structurally, they favour things that have not seen price increases or of lower quality goods that you're basically forced into. Now, in fact, it's got to the point at this stage where CPI is only really a useful measure if you're the sort of person who lives in your mother's basement, you eat pizza that you buy from the local pizza shop, and most of your purchases are digital online purchases. So you're renting a Netflix account or subscribe to a gaming service or something like that, because that's the push effect of always substituting in cheaper and cheaper items. If you are much more like the meme of the Chad dude or the trad wife, and what you want to spend your money on is a home, good food, retirement, and that measure has become completely warped and it doesn't really represent you. And furthermore, every country does it differently. So you can't really compare inflation levels across each other. In fact, there's a brilliant example that I like to cite from the US CPI, and that is the iPhone. So the iPhone is, as I'm sure you're aware, it cost whatever it was like $600 or $700 when the iPhone first came out. And obviously it costs a lot more than that, costs at least double that. They actually managed to record that as a decrease in inflation. The way they did that was because they said, okay, well, the iPhone used to just make calls, and now it's got like a 12 gigabyte camera on it. It does HD video, it does games, it does all of these extra things, and therefore, yes, even though the price has gone up, it does more, and so therefore we're going to record it in the official numbers as a decline of inflation.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.